Hello. Yes, I know. My name is Minister John Rowland III, and I live in Columbus, Indiana. Now, what's really interesting is Columbus, Indiana is kind of right in between Indianapolis and Kentucky. Well, actually, no, not even half. I'm only about a quarter way, well, 1/3 of the way from here to Kentucky. Kentucky's like 75 miles, and Indianapolis Speedway is like 60 miles. So it's pretty close. I'm pretty close to halfway. Okay, today we're going to be talking about worship God, not worshiping. There's a difference between worship and worshiping, because worshiping is the motion that you're doing it. Now, I want to talk about worship in general. So, you see, because worship is when it is something that is worshipped. Now, it could be anything, but we worship God Himself, even though there is others that seem to be gods. They need to be talked to. They need to be interacted with, but they worship God too. So when you get into angels, you see even the angels worship God. So you can't worship an angel. You can't even worship Jesus, because even Jesus worshiped God. So, when you're getting into the word worship and worshiping or worshipped, basically it is worship. You have only one entity or thing that you worship, not to worshipped. That means you did. You might have changed it. Or worshiping as in the process of worshiping that deity or item. So it really gets kind of interesting when you get into worship. So, for even Jesus did worship God, not what God did for him or the ways of God. Jesus did worship God Himself, for who in their right mind would not worship, who would not in their right mind worship anything other than the Creator Himself. That was really kind of interesting when you get into, would you worship a rock? Would you worship a cow? Would you worship anything that's here on earth that could not create other things or beings? So when you get into that concept, it really kind of gets interesting, because all the other things that are what anybody worships, that you should worship the Creator. Now, even an atheist know that things were created by something or someone. Like, if you hold your hand out and all of a sudden pieces of paper just fell in it, well, you know that there had to be a creator of the paper, and somebody had to print it out, and if there's words on it, somebody had to print it out, because it just couldn't have just come out of thin air and just landed in your hand. Well, if it did, there would have been somebody come up and says, can I have my paper back? So, you know, there is a creator of everything. So, I like to take and mess with atheists and anyone that can't perceive what the real truth is by looking at it. Now, there is beings that you could show them, you could sit right there and show them over and over and over that this is the real truth, and they still would not believe you. Like, I cook lunch and I give you a hot dog. Well, if you don't believe that's a hot dog, you're going to tell me it's tube steak. It was made out of steak. Well, you know, could have been. But we called it a hot dog. So that's what I said. It's what you believe and what you perceive to be true to you. Now let's continue this. God sees us not as sinners, which I've said this before, but God sees us as disobedient children. Sin is what you do from your disobedience. And once you're disobedient, is the action, what you do from your disobedience, and they call it sin. And sin is also the result of your disobedience, because sin is what happens when you're disobedient. Now, there's also something else I want to get into, is we have male and or female personalities. Now, a personality makes up your being and who you are. And within your mind and body is what you perceive to be. If you perceive to be a male or you perceive to be a female, body-wise, that is your personality. So God sees us as personalities, not as physical beings. Our personality will live on, which some call it a soul, is actually your personality. So that's kind of really interesting to perceive that you now have come to the understanding that actually your soul is actually your personality, which makes up who you are. Now, because we are a gender personality, what makes us up is our personality. In heaven, it's kind of really interesting when you get into the realm of heaven. The best way to explain it is if you look in a mirror. Now, once you look in a mirror, you see your physical self. And then you see a mirror image of yourself in the mirror. Okay? Your earthly body is who you are, and in the mirror is is your perception of your reflection, which is actually your soul or personality. So that's why I said we live in two different worlds. It's like the two different sides of a mirror. We can touch things, we can see things, we can do things because we are of this earth. Now, the mirror image cannot touch or move something unless we move to make it happen. Now, even though the image in the mirror, even though you touch something outside of the mirror with your finger, doesn't mean that your image in the picture touched anything, because it's a mirror image, which is actually your personality. So really that's the only way it can be explained between our two worlds that we live in. So that means that was what's really interesting was that we displace space. That means we take up space within Earth. Now, our personality, our soul, does not displace space. Now, that's really kind of interesting, to where that means you can see it. You can't touch it, but you can see it. It can move. It can do anything within that space, but it doesn't displace space. Like your reflection doesn't take up any space, it's just there. It's like you really can't, the only way you can explain it is a mirror image. Because everything that here is on Earth takes up space. Now, the best one is, as you're traveling down the road in your car, if there is something in the way, you see it displaces space. That means the only way that you can go through that space is if there is nothing there. If there is something there, you're going to hit it, because it takes up space. So when you really get into that, it's really kind of interesting. So, and when I come across that, I'm going, wow, that's really different. Now, you see, our earthly existence is just that. Our earthly existence within the earth that we live in. Do we preach to one's clothes, the human body? Or do we preach to one's soul and or gender personality? Which is not relevant. Because our job is to teach and preach salvation unto the lost, and let God, once saved, change them from within. We have to let Him do His job. Our job is to get them saved, and His job is to change them from within. So this is why when we try to control what we do with other people and try to tell them how they should live is not up to us. It's not our place to judge anyone. And God doesn't judge anyone either. That was really a concept that was really interesting, to where God does not judge us either, because He sees us as disobedient children. So once we get saved, He guides us day to day to lead us in the right path. That means He'll talk to us, He will guide us, He will do all the stuff that He can do to help us out. Now, there is one other thing you have to realize, that God will never take away our free will. That was really kind of interesting, because once you take away free will, we are like robots that we just do run the program. We just do what God says, and we don't question it, because we do what he says. So that means that he would take our free will away. So this is why he just guides us, and he kind of says, well, if you did this or you did that, it would really help. And then, you can make the choice whether you want to do it or not. So the perception of this is really kind of interesting. Okay, now let's get into the spiritual salvation, which is what we should teach and preach. What is here on earth is meaningless. Now, there was another thing that was brought up, which was really kind of interesting, was the Catholics pray to Mary. Now, this was really kind of interesting when that subject was brought up, and the preacher said, well, it's okay to pray to Mary, but do you want to pray like Mary prays, or do you want to pray to Mary? And they go, oh, we want to pray the way Mary prays. Well, Mary prays to Jesus and God. Our prayers are to God. So they started praying like Mary prays to God and to Jesus. All of a sudden, even the pastor of the church come and said, well, let's pray to Mary. And they'll say, no, we're going to pray like Mary prays, and we're going to praise to God. We're going to pray to God. So that was really kind of interesting, to where if anybody ever comes up to you and say, well, we're going to pray to this or that, or let's pray like Mary prayed. And they'll go, who's Mary? Jesus' mom. Let's pray like she prayed to God. And everybody's going to go, really? Oh, yes. So that was one thing that was kind of interesting. Now, he also said that what was really kind of interesting was this woman come up to him, and she goes, what are you doing the rest of the night? And he goes, he says, the first thing he says, you're talking to a dead man. And she goes, what do you mean? She goes, you're talking to a dead man. The old ways that I used to be are dead. So you're talking to a dead man. Now, if you want to talk to me about God and salvation and talk about church things, I said, we'll sit right here and talk about that. And she goes, no thanks, and she runs off. So that was really kind of interesting, when after you get saved, the old ways will fade away, which will become dead. The old person will become dead, and the new person will take over. That's what I'm talking about, the change from within. Now, I want to talk about one other thing that was really kind of interesting to me. Now, not everybody has a perception of marriage, because a lot of people have a perception that once they're married, they have that piece of paper and they're owned each other. Well, that little piece of paper, all it states is you promise to love and cherish and stay together until death do you part. That's the promise within that paper. That's all it says. That's all it really is. Now, I want to talk about the joy of life. And you can see the next sermon on the joy of life.